Hello everyone. Tonight we journey to a moment that changed the world forever. A moment when the last flickering light of ancient Rome was finally extinguished. When the greatest city in Christendom, a fortress that had stood unconquered for over 1,000 years, fell silent under the thunder of cannon fire and the clash of swords. You might imagine Constantinople and see golden domes, marble palaces, and impregnable walls stretching into eternity. But tonight, set that image aside. You are not an emperor safe behind those walls. You are a citizen, a merchant, perhaps a soldier standing watch as dawn breaks on what will be the final day. The enemy is not distant. They surround you, 80,000 men, the largest cannon ever built, and a sultan who has sworn before God that he will have this city or die trying. So, before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Perhaps like the video if you enjoy these journeys through time, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. It's always wonderful to see who joins us from across the world. Now, dim the lights if you can. Find that comfortable position. Close your eyes. There is nowhere you need to be. Nothing you need to do. Only listen to the gentle rhythm of the story. A story that unfolded on the shores of the Bosphorus, where Europe meets Asia, where an empire that had endured for more than a millennium breathed its last. Take a deep breath. Let the present fade away, and let me tell you about the end of the world. Time, as always, moves without awareness of itself. To those living in the spring of 1453, their world was not ending. It was simply Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. The sun rose over the Golden Horn as it always had. The fishermen cast their nets. The monks chanted their morning prayers in hundreds of churches. The bakers lit their ovens. Life continued, even as history held its breath. Constantinople. The name itself was a legend. For 1100 years, it had stood as the jewel of the Christian world. The heir to Rome itself, founded by Constantine the Great in 330 AD on the site of the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium, it had been designed from the beginning to be eternal. New Rome, Constantine had called it. And for a millennium, it had earned that name. The city's location was a masterstroke of strategic genius. Positioned on a triangular peninsula where Europe and Asia nearly touched, controlled the Bosphorus Strait, the only passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. To the north lay the Golden Horn, a deep natural harbor shaped like a scimitar, perfect for sheltering fleets. To the south, the Sea of Marmara stretched toward the Aegean. To the west, the open land approach was guarded by the most formidable fortifications ever constructed by human hands, the Theodosian Walls. Even now, nearly 1,000 years after their construction, they remain the wonder of the medieval world. A triple line of defense stretching for 4 miles from sea to sea. First, a deep moat, 60 feet wide. Behind it, a low outer wall with its own parapet. And behind that, rising like a mountain range of stone, the great inner wall, 40 feet high and 16 feet thick, studded every 60 yards with towers that soared nearly 70 feet into the sky. These walls had turned back every army that had ever approached them. Huns, Avars, Arabs, Bulgars, Rus, all had broken themselves against this barrier of limestone and brick. The walls had become more than a defense. They were a promise carved in stone. Constantinople would never fall. But in the spring of 1453, as the first warm winds blew in from the Sea of Marmara, that promise was about to be tested as never before. Because outside those legendary walls, an army was gathering. An army unlike any the city had ever faced. His name was Mehmed and he was 21 years old. Sultan Mehmed II of the Ottoman Empire, though history would remember him by another name, Mehmed the Conqueror. But that title had not yet been earned. In the early months of 1453, he was still proving himself, still living in the shadow of his father and his grandfather, still hearing the whispers of his own advisors who doubted whether this young, bookish sultan had the steel necessary to lead. Mehmed had become sultan for the second time in 1451, after his father Murad II died. His first reign, as a 12-year-old boy, had been a disaster, a puppet manipulated by scheming viziers, until his father returned from retirement to restore order. Now, at 21, Mehmed was determined to prove that he was no one's puppet, and he had fixed his gaze on the greatest prize in the world. Constantinople had long been an obsession for the Ottoman sultans. It sat like a thorn in the heart of their empire, a Christian enclave surrounded on all sides by Muslim lands. The Ottomans controlled Anatolia to the east and the Balkans to the west. They held both shores of the Bosphorus, both shores of the Dardanelles. The Byzantine Empire, once stretching from Spain to Persia, had been reduced over the centuries to little more than the city itself and a few scattered outposts. It was an empire in name only, a ghost clinging to the memory of ancient glories. But what a ghost. Constantinople remained the richest, most cultured city in the eastern Mediterranean. Its churches held relics that pilgrims traveled months to see. Its libraries preserved the learning of the ancient world. Its craftsmen produced silk and gold work of unparalleled quality. And symbolically, spiritually, it was the heart of Orthodox Christianity, the seat of the ecumenical patriarch, second only to Rome itself in the Christian hierarchy. To possess Constantinople was not merely to gain a city, it was to declare yourself heir to Rome, to Caesar, to Constantine. It was to become the master of the crossroads of the world. Mehmed understood this. Unlike many of his predecessors who had been content to squeeze the city, to extract tribute and wait for it to wither like a grape on the vine, Mehmed wanted the city itself. He wanted to walk through the gates as a conqueror. He wanted to pray in the Hagia Sophia. He wanted to make the Queen of Cities the capital of his empire. And so, almost as soon as he became sultan, he began to plan. His advisors were skeptical. Some were openly opposed. The Grand Vizier Helal Pasha, an old and cautious man who had served Mehmed's father, argued strenuously against it. Constantinople had repelled siege after siege. Its walls were impregnable. An attack would be expensive, perhaps ruinously so. It would unite Christian Europe against them, Bata Helal argued, to maintain the status quo, to keep the Byzantines weak and tributary, but alive. But Mehmed was not interested in caution. He saw what the old men could not see, that the world was changing. New technologies were emerging, and most importantly, he saw weakness. The Byzantine Empire was not what it had been. The Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos ruled over a city with perhaps 50,000 inhabitants, down from the 500,000 of Justinian's time. His treasury was empty. His army numbered only a few thousand men. Appeals to Western Europe for help had produced little. The Pope promised aid, but only if the Orthodox Church submitted to Rome, a condition that sparked riots in Constantinople's streets. The common people would rather see the Sultan's turban than the Cardinal's hat, they said, and so Mehmed prepared. With the methodical patience of a chess master, he began to position his pieces. First, the throat had to be closed. In the summer of 1452, Mehmed ordered the construction of a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, at its narrowest point, directly across from the fortress his great-grandfather Bayezid had built on the Asian shore. The new fortress Rumeli Hisari, the throat cutter, rose with astonishing speed. Thousands of laborers worked day and night. The Byzantines watched in impotent horror from across the water as the walls grew higher, as the towers took shape, as the guns were mounted. When it was completed in August, the message was unmistakable. The Bosphorus was now an Ottoman lake. Any ship that tried to pass without permission would be sunk. Constantinople's lifeline to the Black Sea, to the grain supplies and potential reinforcements from the north, was severed. The city was isolated. Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos understood what was coming. He was not a great emperor. History had not given him the opportunity to be great. He had inherited a dying empire, a city living on memories and prayers. But he was, by all accounts, a good man and a brave one. He did what he could. He sent desperate embassies to the west, begging for help. He stockpiled grain and weapons. He repaired sections of the walls that had fallen into disrepair. He organized the city's meager defenders into units and assigned each unit a section of wall to defend. Help did arrive, though not nearly enough. In late 1452, a Genoese soldier of fortune named Giovanni Giustiniani Longo sailed into the Golden Horn with 2 ships carrying 700 well-armed and experienced soldiers. Constantine received him with tears of gratitude and immediately made him commander of the land walls. Giustiniani was everything Constantine needed, a professional soldier, an expert in siege warfare, and a man of unquestioned courage. The Genoese and Venetian merchants who lived in the city's Galata quarter across the Golden Horn promised neutrality, though some, like Giustiniani, defied their home cities to fight for Byzantium. In total, Constantine could muster perhaps 7,000 defenders to man 14 miles of sea and land walls. It was pathetically inadequate, but it would have to suffice. On April 2, 1453, the Ottoman army appeared before the walls of Constantinople. It was a sight that must have stopped the heart of every defender who saw it from the ramparts. As far as the eye could see, the plain before the walls was covered with tents, tens of thousands of them. A city of canvas and silk suddenly materialized from the earth. Banners fluttered in the spring breeze. The sun glinted off a forest of spear points. The air filled with the sound of drums and cymbals and the cries of soldiers. Mehmed had brought perhaps 80,000 men, though numbers from this period are notoriously unreliable. The core of his army was the Janissaries, the elite infantry corps, Christian boys taken as children, converted to Islam, and trained to be the finest soldiers in the world. There were the Anatolian cavalry, swift horsemen armed with composite bows, the Bashi Bazouks, irregular troops hungry for plunder, engineers, sappers, artillery crews, and the cannon. Dear God, the cannon. The Ottomans had been among the first to recognize the potential of gunpowder artillery, and Mehmed had commissioned the largest cannon ever built. It had been cast by a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to Constantine, who could not afford to pay him. Mehmed could. The result was a monster. The gun was 27 feet long and weighed nearly 20 tons. It fired stone balls that weighed over 1,200 pounds. It took 60 oxen and 200 men to move it. To fire it required a team of skilled gunners and enough gunpowder to blow a small building apart, which, more or less, was precisely what it was designed to do. On April 6th, the bombardment began. The sound must have been apocalyptic. The great cannon fired only 7 times per day. It took hours to cool and reload, but each shot was an earthquake. The massive stone ball would arc through the air and smash into the Theodosian Walls with a force that shook the entire city. Dust and fragments of stone would explode outward. The walls, those legendary walls that had stood for 1,000 years, began to crack. A siege is not a single dramatic moment. It is a slow grinding of hours into days, days into weeks. It is repetition and exhaustion and the constant gnawing of fear. For the defenders of Constantinople, each dawn brought the same routine. Inspect the walls for damage from the night before. Repair what could be repaired. Prepare for the next assault. The Ottomans attacked again and again. They would fill in sections of the moat with rubble, fascines, and the bodies of their own dead, then throw ladders against the walls and attempt to scale them. The defenders would pour boiling oil and pitch down on them, drop stones, shoot arrows, thrust with spears. The Ottomans would retreat, regroup, and attack again. The cannon continued their relentless work. Day after day, night after night, the walls were pounded. Giustiniani proved his worth. He seemed to be everywhere at once, shoring up weak points, rallying flagging defenders, personally leading sorties to destroy Ottoman siege engines. Constantine fought alongside his men, refusing the safety of the palace. In the evenings, as darkness fell and the fighting paused, he would walk the walls, speaking quietly to the soldiers, offering encouragement. He must have known, mathematically, that the situation was hopeless, but he never showed despair. The Byzantines fought with desperate ingenuity. At night, teams would slip out to repair the walls using anything they could find: rubble, wood, barrels filled with earth. They hung animal hides soaked in vinegar over sections of wall to absorb the impact of cannonballs. They dug ditches behind sections of wall that had been damaged so that even if the wall fell, there would be a second line of defense. Mehmed, for his part, grew increasingly frustrated. He had expected the city to fall quickly. The walls, after all, were being battered apart. But each time his troops breached a section, they found the gap had been repaired overnight or was defended with such ferocity that they could not exploit it. The Janissaries, unused to being stymied, began to grumble. And then there was the Golden Horn. The Byzantines had stretched a massive chain across the mouth of the harbor, preventing the Ottoman fleet from entering. As long as that chain held, Mehmed could not attack the sea walls along the Golden Horn, which were much less formidable than the land walls. This meant that Constantine could concentrate his limited defenders on the land walls facing west. Mehmed's solution to this problem was audacious to the point of madness. If his ships could not sail into the Golden Horn, he would transport them overland. On the night of April 22nd, the Byzantines woke to an impossible sight. Ottoman ships, dozens of them, were sailing up the Golden Horn. It took them hours to understand how Mehmed had built a wooden road greased with animal fat over the hill behind Galata, and dragged his entire fleet, 70 ships, from the Bosphorus to the Golden Horn. The sailors had kept the sails raised, creating the surreal image of ships sailing over land. It was a brilliant stroke. Now Constantine had to defend the sea walls along the Golden Horn as well, further stretching his impossibly thin line of defenders. Morale plummeted. Whispers of omens and prophecies spread through the city. An ancient prophecy said Constantinople would never fall while the moon waxed. On May 22nd there was a lunar eclipse. The moon, full and bright, entered the Earth's shadow and turned blood red. By late May, everyone knew the end was coming. The walls were shattered in multiple places. The defenders were exhausted, gaunt, at the edge of collapse. Ammunition was running low. There had been no relief force from the west, no miracle, just the grinding certainty of mathematics. 80,000 men against 7,000, and a larger number had cannon. Mehmed called a council of war. He had been besieging the city for nearly 2 months. His own men were tired. The Janissaries had suffered heavy casualties. His advisors, especially the old Vizier Halal, again counseled withdrawal. They had made their point, demonstrated their power. Let the city pay a huge tribute and come back another year. But Mehmed refused. He had not come this far to leave with nothing. He set the date for a final orc assault, May 29th. Inside the city, Constantine knew this was the end. On May 28th, he ordered a final religious procession. Icons were brought out from the churches and carried through the streets. The emperor and his commanders followed on foot, Orthodox and Catholic, Greek and Latin, united for one last moment by the certainty of their doom. That evening, Constantine gathered his commanders and gave a final speech. The historians who recorded it may have embellished, but the sentiment rings true. He thanked them for their courage. He reminded them they were fighting not just for their city, but for their faith, their families, the memory of Rome itself. He asked their forgiveness for any failure of leadership. Many in the room wept. That night, Constantine attended a final service in the Hagia Sophia, the great church that had stood for 900 years as the crown jewel of Orthodox Christianity. He prayed before the altar, took communion, and then quietly walked through the city one last time before returning to his station at the walls. He knew he would not return. At 1:30 in the morning on May 29th, the attack began. It came in waves, carefully orchestrated by Mehmed first. The Bashibos, the irregulars, expendable troops meant to exhaust the defenders and fill in the moat with their own bodies. They attacked with wild courage and were slaughtered by the thousands. Then came the Anatolian regulars, better armed and disciplined. They pushed harder, got further, but were still driven back by Giustiniani's veterans. The defenders allowed themselves a moment of hope. They had held, but Mehmed had saved the best for last. At dawn, with the sky just beginning to lighten in the east, the Janissaries advanced. These were not wild irregulars or provincial levies. These were professional soldiers, the finest infantry in the world. They advanced in perfect formation, their white felt caps distinctive even in the darkness, to the sound of their military band, the meta, the drums and cymbals creating a wall of sound that must have been terrifying. They hit the walls like a hammer. The fighting was apocalyptic. For an hour, perhaps longer, the battle hung in balance. Giustiniani was everywhere, his voice hoarse from shouting commands, his armor dented and splashed with blood. And then disaster. A cannonball or a bullet, accounts differ, struck Giustiniani in the chest. He fell. His men carried him from the wall to get him to a ship. The news spread instantly. Giustiniani is wounded. Giustiniani is leaving. Panic rippled through the defenders. At almost the same moment, a small group of Janissaries found a small gate, the Kirka Porta, that had been left unlocked. Historians still debate whether this was accident or treachery. It almost doesn't matter. They poured through, 50 of them, maybe fewer. They climbed the tower above the gate and planted the Sultan's banner. The Ottomans outside saw the banner and surged forward with renewed fury. Constantine saw the banner too. He understood what it meant. The walls were breached. The city was lost. What happened next is shrouded in legend. But the most persistent account says he removed his imperial regalia, discarded anything that would identify him as emperor, drew his sword, and plunged into the melee at the gate. He was never seen again. His body was never identified. The last emperor of Rome died as a simple soldier, sword in hand, in the ruins of his city. By mid-morning it was over. The Ottoman soldiers poured into the city through multiple breaches. The killing began. In any siege, the law of war was brutal and clear. A city that resisted to the last could be sacked. For 3 days, Mehmed had promised his men, Constantinople was theirs. The soldiers spread through the streets like a flood. They killed anyone who resisted, took anyone who did not as a slave. They looted churches, monasteries, private homes. Ancient icons were torn from walls, smashed for their jeweled frames. Manuscripts, irreplaceable documents from the classical world, were scattered in the streets or used to start cooking fires. The screaming must have been unbearable. Mehmed himself rode through the streets in the afternoon. He went first to the Hagia Sophia. A mass was being held, the priests in congregation praying for deliverance even as the soldiers broke down the doors. Mehmed entered the great church, 900 years old, the architectural wonder of the world. He dismounted, picked up a handful of dirt, and poured it over his head as a sign of humility before God. Then he ordered that it be converted into a mosque immediately. A muezzin climbed into the pulpit and gave the call to prayer. The building's identity changed in a moment. True to his word, Mehmed allowed 3 days of sacking. On the 4th day, he stopped it and imposed order. The killing ended, the enslaving ended. He began the work of making Constantinople, which he would rename Istanbul, the capital of his empire. The news spread across Europe like a shockwave. Constantinople had fallen. The impossible had happened. The city that had stood for 1100 years, the last living link to the Roman Empire, was gone. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade to retake it. No one came. The age of crusades was over. Western Europe was too divided, too focused on its own affairs. The 100 Years' War between England and France had only recently ended. The Italian city-states were at each other's throats. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of squabbling princes, but the fall of Constantinople changed the world in ways both obvious and subtle. Greek scholars fled westward, carrying their precious manuscripts with them. They settled in Italy and Venice, Florence, Rome. They brought with them the literature and philosophy of the ancient world, works that had been gathering dust in Byzantine libraries for centuries. This influx of classical learning helped fuel the Renaissance, that explosion of art and learning and rediscovery that would transform Western Europe. The fall also closed routes. Constantinople had been the last land bridge for trade with the East. Now that route was controlled by a Muslim empire. Europeans would need to find other ways to reach the spices and silk of Asia. Within a generation, Portuguese sailors would be probing down the coast of Africa, looking for a sea route to India. Within 50 years, a Genoese sailor in Spanish service named Christopher Columbus would sail west, looking for Asia, and stumble onto a new world. And the walls. The legendary Theodosian Walls had finally failed, not through weakness, but because the world had changed. The canon had announced a new age. Walls, no matter how thick, no matter how ancient, could be breached. Fortification would have to evolve. The age of the castle, of the high wall, was ending. The age of the gun had begun. Mehmed ruled for 30 more years. He expanded his empire to include Greece, Serbia, Bosnia. He made Constantinople glorious again, repopulating it, building mosques and palaces and markets. The Ottomans would hold the city for another 470 years, until the empire finally collapsed after World War I. As for Constantine XI, his fate became legend. The Ottomans never found his body. The Greeks whispered that he had not died at all. He had been turned to marble by an angel at the moment of the city's fall and hidden in a cave beneath the Golden Gate. One day, the legend said, when the time was right, he would awaken, he would return, and Constantinople would be Christian again. It is the legend of the Marble Emperor, and some Greeks still believe it today. The news spread across Europe like a shockwave. Constantinople had fallen. The impossible had happened. The city that had stood for 1100 years, the last living link to the Roman Empire, was gone. Pope Nicholas V called for a crusade to retake it. No one came. The age of crusades was over. Western Europe was too divided, too focused on its own affairs. The 100 Years' War between England and France had only recently ended. The Italian city-states were at each other's throats. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of squabbling princes. But the fall of Constantinople changed the world in ways both obvious and subtle. Greek scholars fled westward, carrying their precious manuscripts with them. They settled in Italy, in Venice, Florence, Rome. They brought with them the literature and philosophy of the ancient world, works that had been gathering dust in Byzantine libraries for centuries. This influx of classical learning helped fuel the Renaissance, that explosion of art and learning and rediscovery that would transform Western Europe. The fall also closed routes. Constantinople had been the last land bridge for trade with the East. Now that route was controlled by a Muslim empire. Europeans would need to find other ways to reach the spices and silk of Asia. Within a generation, Portuguese sailors would be probing down the coast of Africa, looking for a sea route to India. Within 50 years, a Genoese sailor in Spanish service named Christopher Columbus would sail west, looking for Asia, and stumble onto a new world. And the walls, the legendary Theodosian Walls, had finally failed. Not through weakness, but because the world had changed. The canon had announced a new age. Walls, no matter how thick, no matter how ancient, could be breached. Fortification would have to evolve. The age of the castle of the high wall was ending. The age of the gun had begun. Mehmed ruled for 30 more years. He expanded his empire to include Greece, Serbia, Bosnia. He made Constantinople glorious again, repopulating it, building mosques and palaces and markets. The Ottomans would hold the city for another 470 years, until the empire finally collapsed after World War I. As for Constantine XI, his fate became legend. The Ottomans never found his body. The Greeks whispered that he had not died at all. He had been turned to marble by an angel at the moment of the city's fall, and hidden in a cave beneath the Golden Gate. One day, the legend said, when the time was right, he would awaken, he would return, and Constantinople would be Christian again. It is a legend of the Marble Emperor, and some Greeks still believe it today. And so the last day dawned and ended. The Queen of Cities, after 1100 years, bowed her head to a new master. The empire that had begun with Constantine ended with Constantine. The final thread connecting the modern world to Caesar, to Augustus, to the glory of Rome, was cut. And an age, an entire epoch of human history, came to its close in smoke and fire and the thunder of cannon. But empires die so that new things can live. The fall of Constantinople closed a door and opened others. It scattered seeds that would grow into the Renaissance. It forced explorers to find new routes and discover new worlds. It marked the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. History does not end, it only transforms. And now the story is told. The walls are silent. The cannons are cold. Let the echo of that final day fade gently into the past. Allow the voices of the doomed and the victorious alike to quiet. There is nothing more to do now. Just breathe, slowly, deeply. Rest in the knowledge that even endings are beginnings. That even in the fall of great things, new things rise. Sleep now, sleep deeply. Let the story carry you into dreams, and rest.